Welcome back for another night of laughs and good times with 10-Minute Horror. Tonight, we're getting into some hairy shit as the storm moves in on the Terra-Natal Valley and pushes our heroic team into the unwelcoming cavern. Pour 'em if you got 'em. This is the Amazonia Expedition, Part 2, the Morto Interior. No one liked the idea, but the reality was, we were now going to be stuck here for several days, a week maybe, and these storms could last even longer. The rain hit, and we knew we were bunking in the main cavern for the night. We just had to explore it and find the safest place. The cavern itself was a magnificent sight. Though it was dark, we did have powered lights and small generators, as well as flares to take in our surroundings. There were dozens of entryways and stairways that led to walking tunnels and small rooms. The further in we got, the more it appeared to be a mass housing complex carved into the rock that extended far into the mountain. The center of the large cavern appeared to act as some kind of courtyard, and in the middle was a 40-foot wide hole. It was surrounded by large fire pits. The hole dropped another 40 feet down into the earth. At the bottom, there were massive limestone formations. A labyrinth of jagged, needle-shaped rocks had been formed by erosion and pointed up like a naturally arranged bear trap. A horrible stench emanated from it. As our lights moved further down, we saw skeletons. Some were impaled and still, somehow, stuck on the spears. Others were on the floor of the hole. I could only assume it was a sacrificial pit. Most tribes across the planet had some version of the same practice, an offering or ritual slaughter to appease the gods. At the bottom, there were strange holes formed into the side of the pit. They were varying sizes and shapes, but circled the walls, leading in every direction. There was a strange fungus mushrooming out of some of the holes and cracks, and slimes creeping out from others. I couldn't identify the growths from where I was, and had a sneaking suspicion I wouldn't be able to even if I was standing right next to them. One of the flashlights hit the torso and left arm of what looked like one of the previous team, impaled on a limestone spike. It had been a month and a half since they disappeared, and the body was still juicy somehow. The guides were growing more fearful. Even the mercenaries were giving each other nervous looks. My foot tapped against something, and I looked down to see what resembled a scarab shell, or exoskeleton. But the closer I looked, it appeared more organic and plant-based, or fungi, or some mix of the two. What many don't know about mushrooms is they're a perfect blend of animal and plant, and this looked like its evolutionary track had grown faster, far expanding its reach down here. I inspected it further. It was a little thing with tiny, sharp bristles and hooks sticking out in all directions. It must use them to latch onto prey. The storm began to rage outside and swept into the large cavern in gusts. We set up a campsite inside and a perimeter around it. Not that I thought anyone would sleep. As tired as we all were, the rotten stench from the death pit was unshakable. I stayed up, going back over Dwyer's damaged workbook, but my mind kept floating back to the hole, the storm, us being stuck here. Though we were safe from the storm in here, we'd have to have a real conversation about what we were going to do in the morning. If the storm was as bad or worse than expected, we could expect a flood. And the last place we'd want to be is the bottom of a valley in the jungle. What many don't know is this region is home to over 2.5 million insect species, tens of thousands of plants and fungi, and several thousand different bird and mammal genus. And they'd all be coming over that edge from above and slamming down on top of us with hundreds of tons of rainwater. I put the book away, but couldn't sleep. My anxiety was riding high about the storm, so I decided to go out to the entrance and see for myself. I told the mercenaries, and they told me to keep close and not stumble off. They didn't want to come find me. Outside of the entrance was complete and utter darkness. The canopy above acted like blackout blinds, shuttering any illumination caused by the lightning, though I'd get brief, millisecond snapshots of the town as some light snuck through. The windows and doorways of the structures were empty, still. I don't know why I thought I'd catch the eyes of the previous inhabitants staring back up at me, wondering who the trespassers were and what they were doing in their town. A chill settled into my bones, and all I wanted was to be back in my sleeping bag. I stayed up for another hour in my tent before finally falling asleep. I'm not sure how long I was out, but it was still night when I woke up. A scream echoed through the cavern and shook us all. I could see the spotlights shooting on from around the perimeter, and the massive shadow of something on the outside of my tent pressing in towards me. It was long, with multiple legs scratching and grabbing at the nylon fabric separating us. I tore my way out of the opposite, zippered side and saw what looked like a giant centipede. over 20 feet at least, mashing into my tent and sleeping bag. Gunfire roared out, with the centipede taking heavy fire on its armored siding. The bullets eventually pierced through, and the creature shrieked out, and it was blown apart. My ears rang as more gunfire and explosions from hand grenades erupted. I turned to run, but nearly tripped over a grotesque sight. There was a guide on the ground. An even larger centipede than the first one had eaten the man's entire left leg and was working its way into the man's hips and waist. The creature must have used some neurotoxin when it first bit down into him to paralyze the man, and then started feasting, the man feeling all of it. I heard a metal can hit the ground and roll underneath the centipede and the guide. Then my ears popped and I felt heavy pressure jettison me back, and I landed on another guide who'd been chewed in half. The mercenaries were unloading every bullet and grenade they had. I found Rayburn and we rushed over to Miller, who was barking orders. They appeared to have it mostly under control now. There had only been 4 or 5 of the giant centipedes, all of which were blown to hell now. A scream shrieked out from the edge of the hole. One of the guides, the last one, was being pulled over the edge of the hole and disappeared. I yelled that we needed him. He was the one keeping track of our location by clocking our course on the map. The map he carried with him everywhere in his backpack. We at least needed that. Miller quickly gathered who was left. There was Rayburn and 2 other mercs named Dawkins and Wyatt. Only 5 of us now. We started out with 23 men. Miller wanted to drop explosives charges into the hole, but we reminded him that would destroy the map, if it hadn't been already. But we needed it. We needed to try. The team quickly pulled together a grappling system to lower us down to the bottom of the hole, avoiding the limestone spikes. I was given one of the dead mercenaries' setups with some kind of long-barreled rifle with a magazine attached, a handgun, and a half-dozen grenades. All I knew about either of the guns was where the safety was, where the trigger was, and where the dangerous end was. We lowered down to the bottom of the pit. I told everyone to avoid touching any of the slimes or molds along the walls of the hole. In fact, avoid touching literally everything except the map, when and if we found it. At the bottom, we found ourselves staring at several varying sized tunnels, ranging from us not being able to fit to us being able to easily walk into upright. It was an easy decision which tunnel to enter, as the blood smears from the guide led into one roughly shorter than me. We could see movement down the tunnel, and Miller led the way in. We got 20 feet in before we arrived in a large chamber. In the center were 3 smaller centipedes, 12 to 15 feet in length, feasting on the guide's lower half. His upper half, including his backpack with the map, was just feet away from them. Miller got Dawkins and Wyatt to flank his sides as they entered the chamber. Rayburn and I followed slowly, staying just outside the chamber. I could hear a frightening scuttling sound from all over the walls, like the wings of bats mixed with the clicking of beetles. Miller quietly pulled the backpack off the dead guide's destroyed torso and started to back up. But as he did, his heel clicked down on an old bone and the crack echoed through the chamber. The centipedes turned and saw fresh food had entered their home. Dawkins and Wyatt started spraying bullets at the creatures, but that was a mistake. The walls began to move, and all those scuttling sounds took to flight. The air became filled with those little scarab-like creatures from the exoskeleton I found. They were moth-like, but fungi-based, and with the sharp, pronounced flagellates that characterized them microbially. The ground swirled. Rattling joined into the cacophony. So much rattling. Rayburn and I sprinted back through the tunnel, Miller on our heels to keep up. I only looked back briefly, but saw Dawkins and Wyatt swarmed by the tiny creatures, clawing and biting into the exposed flesh, and small puffs of dark smoke spraying out of them like cephalopod ink. Only this wasn't to distract. It was to kill. Rayburn, Miller, and I made it out of the tunnel, but heard more and more sounds of varying magnitudes erupting from the different entrances. A massive, frightening black blob of an organism had spilled out of one opening and was creeping its way through the spikes towards us. Looking at it, all I could think was how much it resembled a magnified version of an aggressive cancer cell, only slime and fungi based, eating and expanding and moving and eating, always hungry, never content. A grenade landed right in its center, and another 2 grenades were tossed into the hole we'd just come from. Miller yelled for us to hit the deck. All 3 explosions went off in a row, but when the first one did, it sprayed the gelatinous fungi creature all over the tunnel in a massive fuck-up on Miller's part. Globs of it hit Miller's back and began to eat through his gear. The second double explosion sent me flying into the entrance of a new tunnel. I landed just feet away from one of the guides. The tunnel was coated in a foul, oozing fungus with large mushrooms in the shapes of fingers reaching out. The guide was being absorbed into the side of the wall. Half his face was now the same color, and texture of the growths, and he was still alive. His skin was sliding off his body and joining a horrific quilt-like patchwork of other skins, all looking like they belonged to our team or the previous one. I saw at least 5 sets of faces on it, rippling like a cancerous waterbed. The guide's arm ripped and pulled away from his body. It started to crawl towards me. Rayburn pulled me up and led me back to the ropes. Smoke was coming out of the tunnel, but I could hear the scuttling starting up again. We attached to the ropes and quickly pulled ourselves up, climbing around the expanding fungi, spreading out and reaching to touch us. Rayburn tried to climb past one, but it sprayed out a dark gas at him. The vapor looked corrosive and quickly burned into his clothes and skin. Miller kept firing down, reloading, firing, reloading, firing. He was the lone reason we made it out of the pit. I only turned back once and saw shadows coming up behind us, occasionally lit by the muzzle flashes of Miller's machine gun. And in those short blinks of light, I saw nightmarish creations of nature that nearly drove me into a state of fear-induced paralysis. But Rayburn was there and kept yelling at me to climb. I crawled over the ledge and back into the large main cavern, pulling Rayburn up now. His skin was going black in large blotches, like he'd been afflicted by a rapid form of frostbite. But he kept moving and fired back down into the pit, giving cover. I turned and saw the bodies of the mercenaries and remaining guides were all gone now from the former campsite, and large, snail-like creatures appeared to be absorbing or drinking the remaining blood on the ground. There was fluttering above, and I caught glimpses of bats with multiple sets of wings, dipping down, nipping at us. The jungle storm was raging outside, and all I could think of, plan-wise, was to hide in one of the exterior structures in the town and try to get up the pathway when and if the storm eases at dawn. I hoped the way up wasn't washed out yet. Miller climbed out of the pit. Open wounds in the form of sharp slashes lined his body. He tried to run forward with us, but something from the pit stopped him. 2 giant pedipalps, one over each shoulder, slammed down, and a spray of blood erupted from Miller's mouth. The guide's backpack dropped from his hands. A series of long, furry legs spread out behind Miller and pulled him back down into the depths to feast. I believe I'd just seen a branch of the genus Phenutria, or the Brazilian wandering spider, and it was the size of an SUV, and there were more. Rayburn sparked a flare, and screeches erupted from the hole like the mere touch of illumination on their skin had been caustic. I grabbed Rayburn by the shoulder, who was now wincing from pain with every step, and we rushed for the hallway that led out. Rayburn was fumbling through his bag and pulled out a rectangular-shaped explosive. I recognized it as a C4 charge. He clicked the timer and dropped it as we ran. A disturbing symphony of ghastly sounds erupted from the depths of the pit, chasing us out onto the rain-slicked and crumbled stairway down. The C4 exploded, sending us flying over the stairs and landing hard on the pathway ahead. I was dizzy, and smoke and dust filled the air and my lungs, but movement zoned me right back in front of me. A set of a half-dozen eyes appeared through the mist. It was one of the Brazilian wandering spiders, a smaller one, damaged badly from the explosion, but was still able enough to take us apart. It came towards me fast, but a spatter of gunfire roared up from beside me. Rayburn was on his back, struggling to get up, but had his machine gun out, firing it off at the creature. The spider darted off into the fog of dust, and I picked up Rayburn, who could barely jog now. I led him straight down the town's throughway, then off to the right. I saw the rocky pathway up. It was still far enough away, but it looked beautiful, like a literal stairway to heaven, etched into the side of the mountain. Rayburn dropped, screaming out. His knees were bleeding, and the blackened parts of his body had solidified and felt like hard wood. I tried to help him along, but he couldn't move forward, and he certainly couldn't make it up the rainy and broken track up and out of this hellhole. The rain was pouring down on us, and leaves and branches were battering the town. I looked back, but couldn't see the opening to the cavern. I led Rayburn into one of the tall structures and brought him up to a room on the second floor. He laid down, becoming very still. I watched him die over the course of a few minutes. His entire body blackened and solidified, then cracked open like burnt wood. The effects of the slime molds in the pit were rapid and devastating. I was too terrified to move. I just sat there and thought to myself, trying to break down as much of the events as I could. The different insects and fungi, highly advanced, were very susceptible to light. That much was clear. The pit had been lined with large fire pits surrounding it. The halls had torch holders and smaller fire pits. I imagined the entire cavern had been filled with them, though we hadn't really gotten to explore. Just as that research paper I'd read had proposed, the fungi kept the ecosystem down there in check. Though it was a continuously hungry and feeding organism, It had a built-in evolutionary directive dating back to its first ancestors of single-celled life forms needing more life to survive. I thought through all the papers I'd peer-reviewed and remembered one about a sinkhole-prone region in coastal Romania called the Meville Cave. Geologists had breached a cave that was filled with blind creatures that hadn't seen the sun in 5 million years. The life forms had adapted naturally to the extreme cold and darkness and thrived. The cave had developed the only fully subterranean ecosystem known to science. We appeared to have found something somewhat similar. Rayburn's body spasmed, his head tilted to the side, and his forehead began to expand, pushing outwards. I realized it was going to explode, likely to spread some kind of spores into its immediate environment. I clutched the gun I didn't know how to use, and the guide's bag, and rushed out in the hallway and towards the room at the back of the structure. I got into the room and heard a small, meaty explosion from Rayburn's head, then tiny flutterings, screeches, cries, silence. I looked out through the windows and could see the trail up from here. I turned back and saw something in the corner. No, someone. A man. He appeared to be a member of the previous team. He was long since dead. Similar to the first member we saw in the middle of the path, this man had horrific growths exploding out of him. But this time, the petrified wood-looking mold had come out of his throat, dislodging his jaw, which hung down near his chest now. A machine gun rested in his lap. The man had written on the wall, in his own blood, "And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon." R 911. I wasn't up to date on my Bible verses, but I assumed the R stood for Revelations. The rest didn't fill me with hope. I stared at the man who had very clearly thought he could wait out whatever was coming after him. I wondered how many more previous team members were littered throughout the structures, having hoped for the same thing. I checked out the window opening in the wall and saw, with a brief flash of lightning, the tail end of a giant centipede entering the first floor doorway to the structure I was in. They'd found us. Of course they had. Our smells probably hung in the air like some delicious path of breadcrumbs. I had to get out. I grabbed my supply vest, gun, and backpack. Along with the guide's bag, I climbed out the window and lowered myself to the roof of the next level. The wooden panels below supported me for one step before collapsing in and dropping me on top of the centipede on the first floor. The creature shrieked, twisting and snapping and trying to get at me. I squeezed my fist holding the machine gun, and it exploded rounds into the ground and up the underside of the creature. The centipede panicked and slithered its long body out of the window. I climbed out the window opening on the opposite side and found myself back on the main walkway, getting pummeled by the rain. To the right, I saw the pathway that would lead me up. It was about 40 feet away. I didn't look left, I just ran. I could hear horrible screeches shaking the town under the roar of the constant thunder, and only caught glimpses of my surroundings as the sporadic lightning snuck through the canopy opening. But I heard and saw enough to know something was right behind me. I turned, gripping the trigger again and showering whatever was behind me with bullets. The muzzle flash lit what I believe was a bullet ant the size of a grizzly bear. My shots had covered its face, and it frantically pulled back, darting down a side alley. I couldn't imagine what one of these creatures' bites would feel like. I turned back and kept sprinting, pulling the one flare I knew I had out. I was going to need it on the climb up. It'd last the first 5 minutes, so if I moved quickly, I could be just out of the creature's reach. I hoped. I got to the pathway up and found it hadn't been affected by the storm. I climbed the first few steps and sparked the flare, using it to find my footing until I was high enough away. I looked back, but the town was swallowed up in the darkness of the storm. Lightning had stopped, but thunder had multiplied, popping my ears. I kept climbing. I was 30 feet up, 40 feet, 50 feet. The flare burned out. All I had were 2 flashlights now. I turned back and saw movement on the path below me, rushing upwards quickly. It was low to the ground. A centipede. I fired several rounds down, but wasn't hitting it. I reached into the supply bag and found the half-dozen set of grenades. I took one and threw it down the path. It bounced off and went over the edge, exploding mid-air. It lit up the side of the wall, and I saw the massive Brazilian wandering spider again. It was coming straight up for me. I took out another grenade and held it for a moment longer, then threw it down at the encroaching centipede. This time, it landed perfectly. It blew up in the creature's face and took off a huge chunk of the pathway, making it now inaccessible without special climbing gear. That took care of the centipede. I looked back down and saw the spider was getting closer. He was right below me, so I took out another grenade and dropped it. The spider pivoted on the wall, narrowly avoiding the explosion and continuing up. I sprayed the last of the bullets from the magazine down at it, and just as it clicked empty, 2 of the arachnid's legs were blown off by the ammo. The spider fell back to the town. As it did, it passed the globular organism, which was slinking its way up the side of the mountain now as well, and it was advancing faster than me. It was going to cut me off, up ahead on the path. I had to quicken my pace. I knew I had 4 grenades left, which I would likely need all of for this thing. I was 10 feet from it as it was getting closer to the path ahead. I decided now was the time. I pulled out the grenade rack and snapped the pins out of all 4. I leaned over the edge and underhand threw the package at the slithering blob. It was a perfect throw, and the timing couldn't have been better. The creature blew apart, sending small and large bits of it falling back down to the town, but the pathway couldn't sustain the explosion either, and it started to crumble, chunks falling down below. I rushed up the path, trying to get past the collapsing section. I felt my legs go out as the entire rock slab shook. Every move was critical as I scrambled, fingernails breaking off and fingertips shredding. I managed to just barely get a hand grip ahead and pulled myself up just as the path below me crumbled away. The rocky debris was landing on the creatures below. There were so many more species of everything than I'd previously seen. The things of nightmares, the things you wish were made up. The lone moment I saw them, with the spark of a lightning bolt, I knew I'd never be the same man I was. Knowing these things were possible made me fear for humanity's future. But the storm hadn't slowed, and it was a long way to the top. I pushed through the canopy, taking a moment for one final look at the small structures, the town, the movement of things that would hopefully never leave this place. Then I continued on and up, finally getting to the top of the path. I made my way to the site we stashed the canoes in, and found 2 extra supply bags and a tent, but I couldn't sleep here. I grabbed the smallest of the canoes and 2 paddles, just in case, and began dragging them through the jungle. I knew a good chunk of the way for the next several hours, and could follow our previous path from the markings we'd left. Even though I was beyond exhausted, I didn't want to stop moving. When I was far enough away, I could pull out the guide's backpack, look over the map, and figure out the rest of the way back. I walked until dawn peeked through the storm clouds, and I found myself in a small clearing. It felt like a divine moment. Somehow, I'd survived, and found this perfect instant where the storm opened up. The sun had found this break in the canopies, and was shining down on me. It gave me warmth and courage to tackle the trip back to civilization. I ate the food I had left over and rested. After a brief nap, I decided to keep moving and opened up the guide's bag. The map wasn't in it. The bag had some clothes, a flask, rolling tobacco, and some dried meats, but no map. I knew I could find my way to the next river launch, but from there, this place was a maze. Swampland leading to lakes, leading to waterfalls, leading to caves, leading to more swampland. I wanted to throw my hands in the air and give up, but the sun from above kept shining down on me, and I kept moving. I found my way back to the river and remembered we came at it from the right, so I'd go left and follow it until I hopefully recognized another marker. The water was calm, but who really knows what's going on afoot under the surface? I had visions of running into the giant anaconda, the black caimans, the satyr Ma tribe. I imagined they'd found the bodies of their dead at our old campsite by now, and were looking for us. Up ahead, I saw a small peninsula I recognized as one we'd launched off from to get in this stretch of water. I could see one of our old campsites, and decided to stop there for the night. The jungle was especially loud, and I had nightmares about all kinds of creeping and crawling things, nesting under my skin, and poking out from open wounds. I felt a sharp pain shoot through my leg and woke up. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and found a large spider bite on my calf. I couldn't find the spider though, so I didn't know how bad it was, or how much time I had. I quickly heated up a knife using a lighter and pressed the hot blade into the bite. Hopefully, that would kill some of the venom, but the toxin was likely already flowing through my veins. I got up and started moving, hoping I'd be able to keep going. Quickly, I felt like I was on a treadmill that was getting shorter with every step. I dragged the canoe an hour before I gave up and collapsed. My vision was going blurry. All my senses felt like they were shorting out. The edges of my sight were vibrating with red dots. I started blacking out, then coming back to. I remember seeing flashes of faces, dark-skinned, aboriginal, native, but the fever dream that had taken over was incomprehensible. I knew what the toxin was doing in my blood, but why was it showing me these people? Was it guilt for the men we'd killed and left? Maybe this was the jungle's way of settling its due. My vision went black for good, and I felt my body moving. Then hospital. The faces I'd seen had been the Satir Ma tribe. They'd found me, taken care of me, and given me their own medicine, then brought me to the nearest village. From there, I was driven to a hospital and flown to a larger one in Lima, where I was stabilized. I'll likely never be able to thank them. I was going to have to give a debriefing of what happened. Rayburn had investors who wanted to know where their exotic plants were to make overpriced drugs with. But all I could think about, sitting in the hospital bed, were those things, and how much I hoped none of them would ever make it into a city, and whether or not that small but growing black mark on my forearm was an infected cut, or what Rayburn had. And that concludes episode 25 of 10 Minute Horror. Thanks so much for listening tonight and every other Friday night. We hope you enjoyed listening to the Amazonia expedition as much as we enjoyed putting it together. We'll see you right back here next week.